It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis, once again from the flight deck. And of course, that means some smart talk radio is in your future. And in this segment, certainly no exception, a subject that we have talked about on this show before, but I think we'll get into quite a bit of depth here. We're going to be talking about Alzheimer's with someone that is very aware of that from a clinical perspective, clinical social worker Stephanie Erickson. We're going to be talking about the disease. We're going to also be talking about seniors in general and those 75 million of us baby boomers that are facing a future, interesting or not. Stephanie, how are you, my friend?
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're happy to have you here. Tell us, give us a little bit of a setup here for our Lewis at Large listeners. Tell us a little bit about your professional career and why Alzheimer's, of all things, is such a focus in your professional work.
Sure. Well, I started as a clinical social worker working with children and families. And then as time went on, I moved into palliative care and started to really appreciate seniors because most of those I worked with in palliative care were, 65 or older. And I really started to enjoy that aspect of social work. And then I just basically developed a specialty in capacity evaluation, so determining whether or not someone can make decisions for themselves, financial or personal. And unfortunately, most of my clients in that realm are suffering from some form of dementia. So it's become a specialty of mine over the last 15 years.
You know, this whole subject of baby boomers, those, again, born loosely 1948 or so till the early 60s, we are aging somewhat gracefully, somewhat not so gracefully, kicking and screaming into our older age. But undoubtedly, like everything from blue jeans to the music that we listen to, and now subjects such as Alzheimer's and dementia in general as a result of old age, that's got to be something that's on being asked of you a lot, I would think.
It is asked of me a lot. Unfortunately, people are asking me about it when they're in crisis. They're not asking me about it ahead of time so that I have an opportunity to encourage people to have discussions with their family and do some preparation that can be done just in case this disease impacts somebody in the family. Most people, and I understand why, because I certainly would not want this disease. I certainly would not want to be sick at all as I'm aging. So I understand why people avoid those discussions. But unfortunately, when you're in a crisis, you're not as able to make good and sound decisions because you don't have all the information necessary.
What about, just from a clinical and medical point of view, if there's a timeline of knowing nothing about Alzheimer's and related sort of diseases, and knowing all of it, where are we on that timeline, do you think?
I think we're at the infantile stages, unfortunately. There's, different research that's being done, and people think, oh, we know this, we know that, and then a lot of stuff is disproven. In terms of the medication, I don't have the numbers, but there are hundreds of medications that have come into the early stages of trials to try and find some sort of a relief for the symptom management, and then we only have a few on the market. It's just a very hard disease area. The researchers are having a very hard time figuring out what exactly is the cause. I think the basic of what we know is that there seems to be a genetic factor to it, and there seems to be some lifestyle factors that influence the development of it, but we don't know much more than that.
Are you, when you are talking to clients, potential clients, or people we work with for a long time, there's only so much. Tell us how you intersect. How do you help them specifically?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a capacity expert. So right. The people who contact me in my specialty, it's usually an adult child. Every once in a while it's a spouse, and someone within their family, let's say the father is suffering from Alzheimer's or dementia, and the family needs to take over managing his finances and to make medical decisions. And there's a legal procedure involved to determine whether or not this father, for example, can actually make decisions for himself. So at the time that I'm involved, the disease has already progressed to a level where the person is already in care, either assisted or full care, or they're about to transition, or they have full-time care at home. So it's pretty, at least in the moderate stages, if not the severe stages.
We want to be really, really careful here to not be alarmist in any way, shape, or form. And you're not on here to diagnose or do anything like that. But if you would, are there some relatively or very reliable signs/symptoms of Alzheimer's that those listening to this program, if they notice this in loved ones, if they notice it in family members, and frankly, at some level, if they notice it in themselves, we might want to be aware of?
Yeah, sure, and I don't want to be an alarmist,
right.
And I think it's important, as you say, not everyone who has even mild memory problems is going to develop Alzheimer's, and I think that's what scares people, so they don't get assistance because they're afraid that's what they have. And often there's something, it's called mild cognitive impairment, which basically people just say, I'm getting old. We all start to have
right.
memory issues as we age. In fact, our memory starts to deteriorate at age 25. Ouch.
Right.
We start having problems, early on. But in terms of the signs that it's something worse, is you really want to start looking at your disruption in daily life. So, for example, if you can't remember, you say, I know I have an appointment tomorrow and it's at 9. God, who was that with? And you don't remember, but then, an hour later you're like, of course, it's with Dr. Smith. And that doesn't happen all the time and it doesn't disrupt your life, it's not going to be a problem. But if your memory losses are starting to impair your functioning in your life, in other words, you're starting to miss appointments, miss events, that's an issue. I think another thing to look at is organization and problem solving. So a lot of times we see that with financial management. So for family members who walk into a home and see stacks of mail, or they find that someone is asking, let's say their son, can you look at this financial statement? I'm really confused. And they just can't make sense of the information that you're saying to them. Now that's interrupting your functioning. That's going to be a problem as well. You want me to keep going, or you want to?
Yeah, and again, we want to be careful here. That doesn't mean you pick up some kind of Excel spreadsheet and look at it and you don't understand it. That's not what you're talking about.
Not at all, because I couldn't do that, and I'm not suffering from the disease. But what I could do is that if you sat down with me and said, here's this Excel spreadsheet, let me explain to you, and you went through it, and I asked appropriate questions, I can integrate what you were telling me, and then I understood. That's a really good sign. Now, we also have to look at level of education, because there are some individuals who haven't had the benefit of a lot of schooling. A lot of seniors in their 80s and 90s, especially those who immigrated from Europe, they never went past 6th grade. So they may not be able to do that because they never really had those basic skills. And there's also couples where one managed the finances all the time, so it's only natural that the other doesn't really have a grasp on what's going on. So I think it's just more about being able to integrate that information, process it appropriately, ask relevant questions, and then understand what's in front of you.
What about, and again, because I would like to have you keep going a little bit longer on this list. By the way, real quickly, again, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the Flight Deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're talking about Alzheimer's and related illnesses with someone who knows for sure, Stephanie Erickson. She is a clinical social worker, and this disease and these issues have been her specialty for over 20 years, working with families and individuals on the issues that they confront. Stephanie, what about specifically, as we sort of continue on this list a little bit, those that may have earlier in their lives had ADHD, all that kind of, obsessive compulsive stuff? Are there necessarily, because of conditions or issues that you faced as a younger person, that necessarily tend to be not necessarily early warning signs, but maybe more predisposed to it?
No, I'm not aware of any research like the examples you gave, ADHD or obsessive compulsive. I'm not aware of any links there. Some of this research that's coming out, though, is starting to note that depression at some point as a younger senior, so maybe sometime in if you're 50, you're not a senior, but let's say starting at around 50 and going up to age 70, they are noticing some connections with that onset of depression. And I think it's hard to make the concrete connection because at that time, around 60 to 65, 66, people are starting to retire. and that's an identity issue as well, and that could lead to depression.
Right.
So again, don't jump to the conclusion that if you're depressed at 65, you have dementia, but that's the only connection that I see, and it really has nothing to do with early childhood at all.
Right. What about also the obvious one, heredity?
Yes, there is a genetic connection as well, and just because someone in your family, for example, your mother suffered from Alzheimer's, does not mean that you will. But they do note that there are some lifestyle factors, and if you are predisposed to the gene, those factors could contribute. So things like diet and exercise are extremely important, which they are anyway, regardless of this disease. But the genetic factor, I think it's around the 60% of those who suffer have a genetic factor.
You touched on the concept of retirement, and I want to explore that for just a second, how it all, in theory, might be bundled up in some kind of a relationship package, and that is someone that has been working outside the home for many, many decades, at some level, to be somewhat successful, has had to focus on something. Whether they're a writer, whether they work in a factory, no matter what they're doing, they're focusing on something and they have a skill that they sort of try to improve all the time. And I'm wondering if that kind of focus, whether it's at work or volunteer work or who knows what, helps keep the mind sharper. And so therefore, when you hit retirement and suddenly there's this onset of lots of sort of free time with less sort of specific work to do, with less deadlines, et cetera, is that where things could start to happen too?
It could, and you want to work your mind just like you work your body. There's no difference. So yeah, when you retire, if you don't get involved in activities, social interactions, and other activities that cognitively stimulate you, your brain's not getting as much exercise, and then things that might be there lurking in the background might come to fruition faster. They might be more noticeable. We also can see that those with higher levels of education, it's kind of a protective factor in terms of the onset. So although they may have a genetic factor and eventually they'll get dementia, the onset is later because they've developed a lot of skills, problem solving, and compensation skills that help protect them from that onset or being a visible onset early.
Who is, Stephanie, whether it's the medical community or who is sort of leading the charge into the research of this disease, and what is impeding progress for them?
Well, the Alzheimer's associations, they're nonprofit organizations, and they do a lot of fundraising that goes into research. And then there's physicians around the world that have different research projects going. And, of course, pharmaceutical companies are always researching medication, and in order to do that, they're researching the disease in of itself. So there is a lot of stuff going on. But then there's other advocates in the caregiving world. So caregiving support groups and nonprofit organizations that support caregivers are also advocating for more research and more discussion about this issue.
Well, let's talk about, again, and if we relate it directly to the work that you do, you work with people that have family members that they believe are maybe early onset, so to speak, and all the way up to those where the relative doesn't even recognize at any level family members. And let's talk about someone, if there's a family or an individual dealing with a loved one, someone that they're close to, that has sort of early onset, and maybe that's not a clinical definition, but what do you tell them? How can they respond and feel helpful or whatever? Tell us about that.
Well, if a family member sees signs of memory loss, confusion, disorientation, and there has not yet been a diagnosis, it's really important to, I think, speak directly to the person you're concerned about. So, for example, if I notice signs and symptoms in my mother, I should directly discuss it with her. If she is not open to those discussions or becomes resistant or oppositional when I'm approaching that with her, then I might appeal to my sister and talk to her a bit and try and get her on board, because what I want for my mom is for her to get to a doctor. Because with an earlier diagnosis, there are medications that can be used, and many of those are only effective on the front end of the illness. They only work to sort of delay the progression. So if you see a doctor too late, sometimes it's too late for the medical interventions as well. So I would start encouraging families right away to address the problem directly with their family members, and then sit down as a team, as a unit, and start talking about the progression of the illness, what are the different things that could occur, and how would this person want to be cared and supported by their family.
Like any disease, Alzheimer's undoubtedly has different levels, I would think, of intensity and progression depending on the individual, correct?
Yes. And symptoms are different. So, I worked with a family on Monday, and she's experiencing what's called social and sexual inhibition. So now she's starting to talk sexually to her son, which is something that she never did in the past, obviously, and it's very uncomfortable for the family. But not all people that have dementia, a form of dementia, have this particular symptom. So some symptoms are easier for the families to manage, and others, like something like my mom is now talking to me sexually, is very, very uncomfortable. So symptoms vary greatly as well, even if the diagnosis is the same.
Do we have are we closing in on what causes this?
No, there are lots of discussions about the buildup of amyloids and plaques within the brain, but not everybody who has these develops the disease. So that makes it really different for, I guess it's pathologists to understand the disease, because there doesn't seem to be consistency. I think for more specific answers on that, you'd be best served to speak with a physician who's doing research. Mine's just third or fourth hand knowledge of that, so...
What about, is there a recognition of the nature of the disease and what can be done and treatment and all the various kind of support and the work that you do? Is it around the world, or is the United States in some way, shape, or form maybe in the lead on this, or are we behind?
I think we're behind. A lot of the stuff that I read, a lot of other countries have some pretty progressive sorts of interventions and housing situations for those who are suffering from the illness. I find, and I don't mean to be too negative, but I find that many of the facilities that offer care and support for these individuals, the staff that work there are not properly trained, and so what happens is that when symptoms emerge, they're managed by medication and not by other interventions, because they take time, they're more difficult, and they're not always working. And so I find that we, as a society in North America, over-medicate, and there's a lot of work that can be done.
There has to be, you've done this for a long, long time, there's got to be tremendous satisfaction. Share with us, if you would, say maybe a story or two, or a case or two, or a situation where you found particularly satisfying professionally for you.
Oh, there's so many to choose from. I mean, really, I don't know if this sounds corny, but every family that I work with, there's a level of satisfaction, because although I'm focused on a particular outcome of a capacity assessment, I'm always able to provide another level of support, emotional support for families. They're very frustrated with the system that they're working within, and I'm able to provide some guidance within that system. And that example I gave you on Monday for the son, I was the first person that he told that to, because he was really embarrassed, and he hadn't even told his siblings that his mother was saying these things to him. So I got a lot of satisfaction from our phone call on Monday, because he finally got to voice some of the stress that he's feeling, and I got to normalize it. I got to give him some referrals and references to different websites where he could read about that particular behavior. I could give him some visualizations of what was happening within the brain. So then he started to say, okay, so this isn't my mom. Oh, yeah, that's right. If she knew she was doing this, she would be heartbroken too. And I think he gained some more empathy for his mother, and then that makes me feel like as a caregiver, he'll give her better care. So even just Monday, it was a great intervention.
This new movie, it's not new, but relatively recently released, called Still Alice.
Still Alice, yeah.
Tell us about, again, I will tell you right now, I have not seen it yet, and it has not been on a wide release yet, but it's coming out for sure. Tell us about your take on that as a little bit of a preview. Tell us what you liked about it, and how did that tell the story? Well,
what is unique about that story is that it's about early onset, and that is not as common as a later onset dementia. So I think it pulls at the heartstrings. It gives people an opportunity to see the disease more clearly, because I find that when dementia affects somebody that's in their 80s or 90s, a lot of people are like, well, they're old, they've lived a good life, and people don't give it as much credit, and they're not as interested in it. So I love that it was an early onset story, because I think it gave the perspective of every family member, their own reactions to it, how they dealt with it as a family, as well as the woman who was suffering, what it was like for her. She was also a very successful woman. And I think that just having the movie come out was just wonderful, because it gives some attention to the disease, which unfortunately doesn't, I don't think, get as much as it should. And actually this disease affects more women than breast cancer. And the breast cancer advocates are great at getting their cause out, and we're not doing as well in this disease group. Not to say that breast cancer is not serious, by the way.
Is our society, are we having frank enough discussions about this condition?
No, we're not. Everyone is scared to talk about it. And like I said earlier, I completely understand. And it doesn't impact everybody, but especially with this disease, the discussions have to be had early on. Because if you have them later, the person who's suffering can't contribute, can't understand, can't be part of the problem solving, has poor judgment often, and so it's kind of like they're losing their opportunity to dictate what kind of care and support they want. So in terms of this disease area, early conversations are paramount.
Well, as we've been talking to Stephanie Erickson. She has done work for over 2 decades, specifically with families and those affected by Alzheimer's. And I'm curious as we sort of start to wind down here, as you look into the future, are you hopeful on the medical front, and how hopeful are you from your point of view as a clinical social worker?
I am hopeful on the medical front. I mean, I'm generally a positive person, and I think that people are working really hard at trying to make sense of this. There are a lot of great nonprofit organizations that are working really hard to improve the research and to get more funding for the research, so that's very positive. And I am seeing an improvement and in increasing numbers, discussions being had, and that can only lead to positive results for the care and support of people, of families, not even just the person, but the whole family who's suffering from this disease.
Well, it is a difficult subject indeed, but one that will be affecting many of us over the coming years. So we've been talking to Stephanie Erickson. Again, she's a clinical social worker with specialty work indeed for over 2 decades with Alzheimer's, those affected by it, and other groups and organizations. Stephanie, how can people find out more about Alzheimer's and also about the work that you do?
Well, in terms of my work, people can visit my website, which is www.ericksonresource.com. That's ericksonresource.com. And, I mean, honestly, all you have to do is look up Alzheimer's Association, and you will get information about a local chapter. And there's chapters all over the country, so it would be very easy for people to connect with that local chapter, and there's lots of information available online.
Well, we appreciate your insights and the work that you do, and best of luck to you, and thanks so much for being part of the show today.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.